In the freezing wilderness of Alaska, a dying grizzly bear is fighting to survive in a world that shows no mercy. The storm rages on, the wind howling like a beast, and there she lies, weak, exhausted, and abandoned. Her massive body is sprawled on the snow. The bear is on the verge of death, and no one is around to help. But then, something unbelievable happens. A man, alone in the wilderness, stumbles upon the scene. What he does next will shock you. The decision he makes changes everything, because sometimes nature isn't just about survival, it's about choosing to help when there seems to be no hope. Stay with us, because this is a story you'll never forget. Luke Keller had spent days trekking through the Alaskan wilderness, trying to find shelter before the storm hit. The wind was biting, cutting through his layers of clothing, and the snow was deep. Each step felt heavier than the last. As the storm continued to intensify, he had been hiking alone for miles, carrying only what he could fit in his pack, a rifle, some supplies, and a small stove. But the weather was getting worse, and Luke knew he couldn't keep pushing through the storm for much longer. He needed to find shelter fast. The air was thick with snow as he moved through the trees when, suddenly, something stopped him. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted movement, a shadow against the white wilderness. At first, it seemed like just another tree or rock covered in snow, but then Luke realized it wasn't. There, in the middle of the snowstorm, lay the massive form of a grizzly bear. Luke's heart skipped a beat. Bears weren't uncommon in these parts, but to come across one in such a condition, it didn't make sense. He moved closer, cautiously. As he approached, the shape of the bear became clearer. It was lying on the ground, not moving. Its body was large, its fur matted with snow, and it seemed to be struggling to breathe. Luke's instincts screamed at him to keep his distance. Grizzlies were dangerous, especially when injured. But something in the bear's posture made him stop. The bear's eyes, wide, glazed, and fearful, locked with his. For a moment, neither moved. The air was thick with tension, the wind howling around them, but it was as if the world had stopped. And then Luke saw it, a soft whimper. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. This wasn't just any bear. This was a creature in pain, in desperate need of help. The silence between them seemed endless. Luke stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had hunted, survived the wilderness for weeks on end. But this was different. This wasn't a predator. This wasn't a danger. This was a call for help. The bear let out another faint sound, a low, pitiful noise that pulled Luke from his thoughts. He looked down at the creature, seeing the struggle in her eyes. She wasn't attacking. She wasn't charging. She was fighting to survive. And the only thing standing between her and death was him. Luke swallowed hard. He could walk away. He could leave her to die. The wilderness would take care of the rest, and he could keep going, focusing only on his own survival. But as he looked into the bear's eyes, her fear, her pain, her vulnerability, something inside him shifted. He couldn't just leave her. He didn't know what would happen if he helped, but he couldn't just walk away. The decision was made in that instant, and it would change everything. Luke slowly kneeled, his body tense, keeping a respectful distance. He had to act fast. The storm was getting worse, and the bear was in no condition to survive for much longer. But if he could get her to shelter, maybe, just maybe, he could save her. He reached out his hand, trembling as he gently touched the bear's fur. It was cold. Too cold. But there was still a flicker of life in her, just barely. Luke's heart pounded. This was his moment. Luke's heart raced as he slowly lowered his hand, gently touching the massive body of the bear. The cold fur beneath his fingers was a stark reminder of the brutality of nature. The storm howled around him, the wind whipping snow into his face. But the only thing Luke could focus on was the bear in front of him. Its chest rose and fell weakly, but there was no strength in it. No fight. It was barely hanging on, and time was running out. Luke swallowed hard, his breath coming in ragged bursts, mixing with the freezing air. He had always been prepared for the wilderness, had always trusted his instincts. But this was different. This wasn't a hunt. This wasn't survival in its usual, familiar sense. It wasn't about outsmarting the wild or claiming victory. This was about compassion. This was about choosing to act when every instinct told him to turn and walk away. The bear's eyes fluttered, just barely. For a second, Luke thought he had imagined it. But then, another weak, desperate breath. The bear wasn't dead. It was alive. But barely. And Luke couldn't stand to let it go. He had always trusted his ability to survive in the wild. He could handle the cold, the storms, the long nights alone. But in this moment, nothing had prepared him for the feeling of responsibility pressing on his chest. He had a choice to make. He could leave her here. Let nature take its course. It would be the easy thing to do. The logical thing. He was alone, in a dangerous place, and there was no guarantee that helping would lead to anything but disaster. But then, he looked down at the bear again. At the desperation in her eyes. The hopelessness. The knowledge that she had no way out of this. Luke's hand trembled as he ran it over her fur again. He knew what he had to do. He had to help. He had to act. He took a deep breath, fighting the adrenaline that was making his hands shake. The cub. He couldn't leave it here either. That small, vulnerable life could be taken by the storm just as easily as its mother was being taken by the cold. Without thinking, Luke reached into his pack and pulled out the first aid kit. It was a basic kit, something that might help in a small scrape or a cut, but it was the only thing he had. He applied what little knowledge he had of caring for injured animals, doing everything he could to stop the bleeding from the bear's wounds. Every move felt like it took longer than it should have, and every decision felt heavier than the last. He had no idea if it was enough, but he had to try. The wind howled louder, almost as if mocking him for his efforts. He could hear the creaking of the trees around him, the flurry of snow, but there was only the bear in his mind, her breathing growing softer by the second. But then, a sudden movement. The bear's large body shifted, a sign of life. Her head turned weakly toward him. He met her gaze, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes, recognition, a shared understanding that despite everything, they were in this together. She wasn't alone, and neither was he. Luke took a deep breath and gently rolled the bear onto her side. Her breathing was still shallow, but now it wasn't quite as shallow, it wasn't as weak. She was responding. He had no idea what would happen next. The wilderness was unpredictable, and the cold could kill them both in an instant, but there was hope, a glimmer of hope, that was more than enough to push him forward. He scooped the bear up as gently as he could and started making his way back to his cabin, the snow swirling around him with a vengeance. The storm had turned from a heavy snow to a biting wind, cutting through his clothes, but it didn't matter. Every step was heavy, each one digging into the snow, but Luke didn't stop, not for a second. He couldn't, not when the bear was still fighting. The journey back to the cabin felt like a lifetime. The wind continued to tear at his face, and every step seemed harder than the last, but the weight of the bear in his arms reminded him why he couldn't give up. She needed him, and he wasn't about to let her down. As he neared the cabin, the warm glow of the fire shining through the window was a beacon in the storm. He had made it. They had made it. Luke pushed open the door, stepping inside and carefully laying the bear down by the fire. The warmth from the hearth immediately began to work its magic, and for the first time since he had found her, Luke felt a small sense of relief. The bear's eyes fluttered again, and for the first time she seemed to relax. She was alive. He had saved her, for now. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the small cabin. Luke sat on the edge of his chair, staring at the bear, which lay close to the fire, its massive form now wrapped in blankets. Her fur was still damp with ice, but the warmth of the room was slowly working its magic. Luke watched as her chest rose and fell, each breath still shallow but stronger than before. It had been hours since he had carried her back to the cabin, and he could still feel the cold biting at his skin, the weight of the snowstorm that had pushed him to his limit. His muscles were sore from the hike, but more than that, there was a deep exhaustion inside him, the kind of weariness that didn't just come from the physical effort of moving through the storm. It was the kind that came from carrying something so fragile, so vulnerable. Luke leaned forward, reaching out a hand to gently touch the bear's side. Her breathing was steady, and though her eyes were closed, there was a calmness to her now that hadn't been there when he first found her. The storm outside still raged on, but in this moment, inside the warmth of the cabin, there was a sense of peace. But it didn't last. The bear let out a low groan, and Luke's heart skipped a beat. She shifted slightly, the blankets moving as she tried to adjust her position. The groan turned into a low growl, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Luke freeze. Her eyes flickered open, revealing deep brown irises that locked onto his. There was something in them, something both wild and understanding. Luke's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, unsure of what to do. Should he step back? Should he speak? But the bear didn't move to attack. She didn't show any signs of aggression. She simply watched him, her body trembling slightly under the blankets. Her eyes were filled with something Luke couldn't quite place: gratitude? Confusion? Luke swallowed hard. He had seen bears in the wild before, but this was different. He had never been this close to an animal in distress. The weight of responsibility, the need to keep her alive, was something he wasn't prepared for. But as she looked at him, it was as if she were asking for reassurance, as if she were wondering whether she could trust him. Luke's hand hovered over her fur, and for a moment he hesitated. But then, slowly, he placed his hand on her side again, feeling the warmth of her body beneath the thick layer of blankets. The bear let out another soft grunt, this time more content, and her breathing began to slow, becoming steadier. For a brief moment, Luke allowed himself to relax. She was still alive. He had done what he could, and now it was just a matter of time. He could only hope that she would recover. The fire crackled again, and Luke moved to stoke the flames, adding a few more logs to keep the warmth going. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of burning wood, a stark contrast to the frozen world outside. He looked back at the bear, her body still, but the rise and fall of her chest told him everything. She was hanging on. She was fighting. But how long could she survive like this? How long could he keep her alive in these conditions? The uncertainty gnawed at him. The storm had already taken so much time, energy, hope, and there was still no sign that it would let up. They were trapped. The blizzard outside was relentless, and there was no telling how long it would last. Luke stood up, walking over to the small supply shelf where he kept extra food and gear. His fingers moved over the familiar items, his mind still racing with thoughts of the bear and how best to help her. He had no experience with animals like this. He had no experience healing the wounded, especially a creature this large. His thoughts were clouded with doubt, but he pushed it aside, grabbing a few cans of food and a small pot. Returning to the bear, Luke carefully placed the food near her, making sure not to startle her. She was still awake. Her eyes flicked to the food, but she didn't move. The exhaustion in her body was palpable, and Luke could see the toll the storm had taken on her. She had been caught in the wilderness, alone and vulnerable, and now it was up to him to nurse her back to health. He prepared the food as best he could, warming it over the fire. He wasn't sure how much she could take, but he knew he had to offer something. After a few minutes, he gently scooped the food into a shallow bowl and moved closer to the bear. "Come on," he murmured, his voice quiet, reassuring. "You need to eat." The bear's eyes met his again, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in them. Slowly, cautiously, she moved her head closer to the food, her large nose sniffing the air. Luke watched, his breath held. Then, to his amazement, the bear began to eat, not much, but enough to show that she was still willing to fight. Luke exhaled, feeling the weight on his chest lighten just a little. He could see the faintest sign of life in her now. He could see that she was going to make it. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The storm continued to rage outside, the howling wind and relentless snow obscuring everything beyond the cabin's windows. The fire crackled softly in the corner, a faint orange glow casting long shadows across the room. Luke sat in his chair, his eyes never leaving the bear. Her massive body, now slightly less rigid, still lay motionless on the blanket, but there was a subtle rise and fall of her chest, slow but steady. Her breathing, though shallow, was a sign of life. Luke couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But at the same time, he knew that this wasn't over. She was far from out of the woods yet. Her injuries were severe, and her strength was still fading. But at least, for now, she was still here. She was still fighting. He wiped the exhaustion from his face with a rough hand, feeling the weight of the moment pressing in on him. The cabin was small, and the fire was warm, but outside the walls, the wilderness was a wild, unforgiving force that showed no mercy to anyone, especially not to a motherless bear struggling to survive in a blizzard. Luke was her only chance. But as the hours passed, Luke began to notice something. The air had changed. There was a new feeling in the cabin, a subtle shift that made his senses heighten. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was coming. A presence, almost. The cub was still weak, its small body barely able to move, but it had taken to resting quietly in its blanket. Luke had fed it again, giving it small portions of food, carefully monitoring how much it could take. He knew the storm wasn't letting up, and the threat of hypothermia still loomed. The cub needed to be kept warm, but he also needed to build its strength. Then, the unmistakable sound of paws crunching in the snow caught his attention. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but as the sound grew louder, Luke's heart sank. He could feel it in his chest, a tightness, a sense of danger creeping in. The bear's head moved slightly, her eyes flicking toward the door. Luke held his breath. This wasn't just the wind. Something was out there. something big. He grabbed the rifle hanging on the wall beside him, but his hands were shaking, unsure whether to prepare for a fight or just wait and see. The bear seemed to sense it too, her gaze intensifying, her body tensing as if she could feel the weight of the moment. Luke slowly moved toward the window, peering out into the blizzard. The visibility was nearly zero, the snowflakes so thick they almost obscured the trees. But there, just on the edge of the clearing, he saw it. A shadow. A dark figure moving through the snow. His breath caught in his throat. The mother bear. She was massive, far larger than the one inside the cabin, and she stood still for a moment as if trying to find the scent of the cub. Luke's pulse quickened. He had no idea what would happen now. The mighty mother had come, no doubt searching for her lost cub, and Luke had no idea how the two bears would react to each other. Would the mother attack? Would she trust him? The silence in the cabin was suffocating as Luke lowered the rifle and stepped back from the window, his heart thudding in his chest. The mother didn't move right away, but her presence was undeniable. The air seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the inevitable. Then, something surprising happened. The cub inside the cabin stirred weakly, its tiny body shifting slightly under the blankets. The sound was faint, but it was enough. The mother heard it. With a soft growl that seemed more resigned than anything, the massive grizzly bear outside stepped forward, moving closer to the cabin. Her eyes locked on the door. Luke felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a moment of mutual recognition. He moved toward the door slowly, carefully, with no idea what would happen next. Every step he took felt like it echoed in the stillness of the cabin. He had to make a choice. The bear outside was waiting. Luke hesitated. If he opened the door, would she come inside? Would she trust him? What if the cub was too weak to survive and he was just prolonging its suffering? But then again, he couldn't just keep the cub inside forever, sheltered from its mother. It needed to go back to the wild, to its natural place. And so did the mother. The tension was unbearable. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Finally, Luke reached the door and slowly opened it. A wave of cold air rushed in, but he didn't hesitate. The mother bear was there, standing just a few feet away, her massive form framed against the snowstorm. Luke stepped aside and whispered, his voice barely audible, "You can have her back." The mother bear didn't charge. She didn't react violently. She just moved forward slowly, cautiously, until she was beside the cub. She sniffed the air, her nose twitching as she recognized the scent of her baby. Luke stood back, his hand resting on the rifle but his gaze fixed on the bears. This wasn't the time to fight. He had done his part, now it was time to let nature take its course. The mother grizzly bent down and gently nudged the cub with her snout. It was a soft, careful touch, an act of love and recognition. She had found her cub, and now she would take care of it as only a mother could. Luke watched silently as the two bears shared a moment of quiet recognition. The cub, weak and trembling, stirred and began to crawl toward its mother. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, Luke felt a sense of peace. Luke stood still in the doorway, his breath visible in the cold air, watching as the mother bear gently nudged her cub, coaxing it toward the shelter of the trees. The cub, still weak and unsure, followed her with unsteady movements, its tiny legs barely able to keep up. Luke's heart clenched as he watched the scene unfold. There was something profoundly moving in the way the mother grizzly took her cub into her care. It wasn't just an act of survival, it was love, raw and unconditional. He stood there, his body numb from the cold, not knowing what to do but not wanting to intrude. The storm outside had not let up, and the wind howled through the trees, but inside there was only silence between the man and the bears. For the first time in what felt like hours, Luke's mind was quiet, no thoughts of survival, no urgent plans for the next steps, just the image of the mother and her cub reunited in the wilderness. It was a reminder of something deeper than survival, a reminder of the bond that existed in the natural world between creatures who lived side by side, connected by instinct and the will to protect. As the mother bear and her cub moved into the trees, Luke hesitated before stepping outside. The cub was walking now, its steps still faltering but gaining confidence. The mother looked back at him for just a moment, her dark eyes meeting his in a brief, silent exchange. There was no aggression, no fear, just a quiet acknowledgement. She had trusted him to keep her cub safe, and he had done so. Now it was time for them to continue on their journey. Luke's heart tightened, not out of sadness, but from something he hadn't expected, the realization that his actions had made a difference. The wilderness was ruthless, and survival was never guaranteed, but in that moment, the wilderness had shown him something powerful. Compassion was stronger than any weapon. The mother bear and her cub moved further into the forest, their silhouettes blending into the whiteness of the snowstorm. Luke stood for a moment longer, watching them disappear into the storm, knowing that he had played a small but significant role in the survival of these two creatures. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if the cub would make it through the winter or if the mother would be able to protect it against the harsh conditions. But he knew that in a world where it often felt like everyone was out for themselves, he had made a choice to help. He turned back to the cabin, the door creaking slightly as he pushed it open. The warmth inside hit him like a wave, but there was a new sense of peace in his chest. The storm outside still raged, but for now, Luke had done everything he could. As he closed the door behind him and leaned against it, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. The exhaustion in his body was overwhelming, and the adrenaline that had kept him moving for so long started to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. He sat down near the fire, the flames flickering softly in the hearth. He thought back to the first moment he saw the bear lying half dead in the snow, how far he had come since then, how much he had been willing to risk to help a creature that had no way of asking for help. Luke was a man who had survived the wild on his own terms, and he had faced countless dangers. But this was different. This wasn't just about the survival of a man or an animal. This was about life and death, about compassion in its purest form. It was then that he realized that the true wild wasn't just the harshness of the landscape or the danger of the animals. It was the connections between them, the understanding that at the core of survival, there was an unspoken bond between all living creatures. The warmth from the fire seeped into his bones as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing as the weight of the day settled on him. He had saved a life, or at least he had given it a chance, and that was enough. The storm outside had begun to subside, the howling wind replaced by the soft patter of snow against the cabin's windows. Luke sat in his chair, staring into the flickering fire, the warmth from the flames seeping deep into his bones. It had been hours since he watched the mother bear and her cub disappear into the wild, but the memory of their eyes, of their unspoken connection, kept him grounded. He had done what he could. Now, it was up to them. The silence inside the cabin was both soothing and heavy. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the space, but Luke's thoughts were louder than anything around him. The weight of the decision he had made lingered in his chest, pressing against his ribs like a constant reminder of what had happened. The wilderness had always been harsh. The storm had been brutal, testing Luke's limits. But it wasn't just the environment that challenged him, it was the decision to act when he didn't have all the answers, to step in when nature would have left the bear to die. He had intervened, and though it had been a gamble, he couldn't ignore the fact that the bear was still alive. Luke knew that survival in the wild was a constant fight, a struggle to make it from one day to the next. But what he had learned in these past hours was that survival wasn't just about being strong. It wasn't just about outlasting the storm, the hunger, or the cold. It was about compassion, about stepping outside yourself and deciding to help, even when the odds were stacked against you. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the exhaustion settle deep in his muscles. His body ached, and his mind felt heavy with the weight of the wilderness, of the choices he had made. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The storm outside was nearly over now. The wind had calmed, the snowflakes softening as they drifted lazily to the ground. The world outside was still and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic force that had kept him trapped inside. He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, and walked to the window. The trees were swaying gently in the light breeze, the snow clinging to every branch, every surface. Everything looked so peaceful, so serene, as if the storm had never happened. But Luke knew better. The wilderness was always changing, always in flux, and it would take only a moment for the chaos to return. He turned away from the window and glanced at the small table in the corner where the bear's blanket lay, still folded, untouched since she had left. The warmth of the fire felt different now, as if it had lost its purpose. The bear was gone, the storm had passed, and the wilderness had reclaimed what was its own. Luke's mind drifted back to the moment he had opened the cabin door, to the brief exchange between him and the mother bear. She had trusted him, she had accepted his help, and for a brief, fleeting moment, their paths had crossed in a way he would never forget. There was something profound in that moment, something that went beyond survival. It was a shared understanding, a silent agreement that sometimes survival was about more than just making it through the storm. It was about understanding the vulnerability of others and offering a helping hand, even when the world tells you to look the other way. Luke had never been one to seek validation for his actions. He had always lived alone, had always relied on himself to survive. But there, in the quiet of the cabin, in the aftermath of the storm, he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't alone, not really. He had shared something with the bear, with nature, that no man could ever truly comprehend. In a world full of uncertainty, danger, and constant struggle, there was a bond between all living things. It wasn't something you could control or predict, but when it happened, it was undeniable. Luke stepped back from the window, taking a final look at the snow-covered world outside. The storm was over, but the wilderness would always be unpredictable. It would always be harsh. But as he turned back to the fire, he felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. A gratitude for the moment he had shared with the bear, for the quiet bond that had formed between them, and for the reminder that sometimes the greatest strength comes from choosing to help, even when the odds are stacked against you. Luke grabbed his pack and made his way to the door, the familiar weight of it resting comfortably on his shoulders. The wilderness was still there, waiting for him, and he would meet it on his terms. But this time, he would carry something with him that he had never carried before, a sense of connection. With one last look at the cabin, Luke stepped outside. The wind had calmed, the storm had passed, and the world was quiet once more. But inside, Luke knew that the journey had just begun. The air outside was crisp and clean, the heavy snow that had once blinded him now giving way to a calm stillness. Luke stood at the edge of the cabin, the door creaking behind him as he stepped into the wilderness that stretched endlessly in front of him. The storm had passed, leaving the world quiet and serene, the snow-covered trees, the untouched white plains. All of it looked like a landscape from another time, frozen in a moment of peace. As he gazed out into the wilderness, Luke felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had survived the storm. He had helped the grizzly bear. But there was something more profound that had changed within him. Something deep inside had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with the world around him. He had lived a life of solitude for so long, surrounded by the raw brutality of nature, always alone with his thoughts, always reliant on his skills to survive. The wilderness had been his companion, his constant, his teacher. But now, after what he had experienced, Luke realized that the wilderness was more than just a harsh, cold force. It was also a place of incredible beauty, of connection, and of life. Luke's thoughts drifted back to the moment when he first found the bear, broken and alone in the snow. How he had been faced with a choice, to turn away and leave nature to take its course or to step in and help. He had chosen to help. He had chosen compassion over fear, over the primal instinct to protect himself. That decision had changed everything. Luke had never truly understood what it meant to feel a bond with the creatures of the wild. He had always viewed them as something to be respected but never as equals. Yet in those quiet moments with the grizzly bear, he had felt something shift, something that was beyond survival, beyond instinct, something that had connected them. For the first time, Luke realized that he wasn't just an observer of nature, he was a part of it. He took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs. The landscape before him was raw and untamed, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like home. It felt like a place he could truly belong, a place where his actions could have meaning, where he could make a difference, even if it was just for one small, fragile life. Turning away from the wilderness for a moment, Luke walked back into the cabin. He closed the door behind him softly, but not without a sense of finality. The cub was gone, the mother was gone. They had made it. They had found their way back to each other, back to the wild where they belonged. But Luke knew his life had been irrevocably changed. He had helped them survive, but more than that, he had learned something about himself. The lesson had been hard-earned, but it had been worth it. Compassion wasn't a weakness. It wasn't something to fear. It was, perhaps, the greatest strength of all. Luke picked up his pack and slung it over his shoulder, heading toward the door once more. The wilderness was waiting for him, as always. But this time, he wasn't afraid. This time, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that his connection to this wild, untamed place was more than just a matter of survival. It was a bond that would never break. With one last look at the fire crackling in the hearth, Luke stepped outside into the quiet of the snow-covered world. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the landscape, turning the snow into a shimmering sea of white. He took a deep breath, the air crisp and fresh against his skin, and began walking once more into the wild, knowing that he was no longer just a man in the wilderness, he was part of it, and it was a part of him. What started as an act of survival became a story of compassion, connection, and a reminder that sometimes we all need to lend a hand, even when the odds are stacked against us. Luke's decision to help the grizzly bear changed everything. It showed us that compassion is the greatest strength we can offer. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in the power of compassion and survival. Comment below, have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between survival and helping someone or something in need? Let us know how you would have acted. Don't forget to turn on notifications to be the first to hear more emotional real-life stories like this one. Thank you for being part of this incredible journey with us. Until next time, let's stay connected with the wild.